Well, good morning, everyone. A little bit wet this morning, but it's a beautiful morning nonetheless. The birds are very happy. The various members of the thrush family, the hermit thrush and the wood thrush and others, they're out, and I think they've got just the prettiest bird song. There's many other birds too, of course. I wanted to comment briefly on a video that's, or actually a topic that's kind of making the rounds right now, one video in particular. And it may not be a topic that many of you are familiar with if you're not in the photographic sort of creative space. And it has to do with Adobe and their various Photoshop line of products and AI. And it's a video, the video I'm referring to specifically is one by Tony Northrup. He's kind of a YouTube photographer, makes, lots of content, written a number of books, sort of how-to-ish books. He and his wife do a reasonable job of, camera reviews and lots of tips and even kind of some photography debunking content about ISO and lens filters and many other things. And he made a video not that long ago talking about Adobe and their newest end user licensing agreement, and in particular their use of AI in their products. His concern was that this end user licensing agreement was kind of paving the way for Adobe to be able to look through your photographs with the stated reason being to, like many companies will do, to improve user experience and to, identify problems or something like that. But it does give them a very vague but implicit ability to scan your catalog, and arguably it's not going to be some guys in a computer center somewhere scouring over tens of thousands of photos a day looking for a child, etc. This is sort of the premise under which Apple did it a while back with their cloud services, is that we're looking for illegal instances of things involving children. That got people looking at the end user licensing agreement a little closer. But also what they sort of found out, Tony Northrup and his wife, is that they also are training Adobe's AI model, which is part of the package now, on stock photography that he and his wife, and of course thousands and thousands of creators, had been selling to Adobe all along. And they're pretty mad about that because, of course, if you do the quick mental calculation, what they're doing is they're training AI to replace them, right? All of their past work is going to be used to train AI. AI will take over, and there really won't be a market for stock photographers anymore. On its face. I don't think that's actually true necessarily because, as I've said before, AI generated content like that will be at some point, it's going to be self-referential, right? You're going to end up with AI models that are actually trained potentially on content created by other AI models. And, the whole thing starts to fall apart if you don't have new content, fresh content made by human beings into the pool. You need that constant. But I think there's going to be some growing pains when it comes to that. And also, I could be wrong, right? It could be that we end up with this completely circular, after a point, self-referential. It's already derivative, right? The AI isn't creating anything necessarily. It is deriving something from multiple sources and making a compilation, if you will. Let's say you go to Midjourney and you're asking it to create an image for you. It's been trained on all kinds of similar images to perhaps the one that you're asking for, and it's going to be making some sort of a compilation of that. But why am I talking about all this? Well, I thought it interesting. I've had my own theory about why a lot of countries will forego, like for instance, why talk about a lot of countries? I'll talk about mine. Why would our country forego good sources of energy that exist here and instead import from way overseas, from countries that have a pretty crappy human rights record? Let's just say that. Why would they do that? It certainly can't be an environmental play, can it? My theory has been because they are trying to save the resources that are in this country for themselves. Now, that sounds probably pretty conspiratorial. What do you mean themselves? What, don't you mean us? No, I don't mean us, potentially. And I don't know, obviously. But I found it interesting that, I'm listening to lots of videos about autonomous vehicles and other forms of automation, which I warned about years ago on my channel, and a lot of people poo-pooed it. But, they're clearly working very hard on all of these things. And again, when I say they, I don't mean in a conspiratorial way necessarily, because this is all you need is you don't need a conspiracy. You need a bunch of self-interested individuals, trying to win the market, right? And then you got to have a few people probably at the top with some motive and some political power. Those are the people who can actually shut down huge pipelines and other things. But I found it interesting that Tony Northrup was talking about this idea of the fact that they are training the model that's going to replace them. And I thought, that's interesting. It kind of coincides a little bit with my theory. Quiet, personal theory, till now, I guess, that the powers that be are basically using us to replace ourselves, right? This is why, I was listening to a video about crossing guards. 1 in 4 or something in San Francisco claim that they have been almost hit by an autonomous vehicle. Now, I'm always very wary of, 1 in 4 type of claims, right? Because we know how those can be doctored up and whatnot. However, one of them was interviewed and said, I think people should be driving these cars. Like, I shouldn't be walking children across the street and have to look to see where there's a person in the car and behave differently. And I mean, obviously, if I'd be a terrible crossing guard because I'd be trying to make eye contact with every driver. That works maybe in a small town, probably doesn't work in San Francisco. But I think she makes a valid point at this point in time. There should be people in those cars. Why aren't there? Well, of course, because people are being replaced. And that is the goal of everything. And that includes more than just industry like manufacturing and business. It kind of includes everything if you think about it. They want to replace people in everything, including now the artistic fields, right? And so in many ways, especially as we adopt these technologies, we are actually beta testing a lot of this stuff. A lot of people don't realize this, but that's what's actually happening. The beta testers are us, and the mechanical engineers and the electrical engineers, the computer software guys, they're potentially designing their own replacements too. I've said years ago now in videos that in the future, the best computers will be designed by other computers, right? AI will design the best machines and et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing that computers are really good at. That's the thing. And human beings, it takes us a long time to reach that level individually, and of course, the funny thing is, as much as I despise computer models for mostly the way they're employed, because, people treat, for instance, climate models as though they're somehow scientific, and they're, of course, just not. That's not how any of this works. But what computers are very good at is modeling, trying different things out and running them out to their potential logical conclusion. And of course, the fewer confounding variables you have, the better. So that's the problem with the climate models, is the number of variables are just, I think, probably pretty much uncontrollable. The number of feedback mechanisms and other things like that. It doesn't make it very plausible, but it does when it comes to simple machines and even complex machines and other things, right? To be able to run very cheaply and effectively certain models to see what problems may occur before you start actually developing prototypes and things like that. And of course, in manufacturing, take a look at some of the, well, there's many, but Mitsubishi and Toyota have got some amazing assembly plants with robotics in there that just blow your mind. And if you want to get scared at all about the future, or excited, you know, it depends on your viewpoint on this. Look at some of the, what is it, Boston Dynamics or whatever, their robotics, they're amazing, right? While Elon Musk has got some guy in a fucking full-on leotard, it looks like a fencing outfit, you know, doing a janky dance. Meanwhile, Boston Robotics is running out a door, down a flight of steps with a package, setting it down on the pavement, turning around without turning around and running back the other way up the stairs, and it's a completely fluid and fast motion. Like, that's quite impressive, right? And that's, you know, so these guys, like I said, the engineers and all that, they're actually designing their replacements, you know, in an ultimate sense, not directly right now probably, but in an ultimate sense they are. And we, the consumer, are beta testing all of this stuff. And you can say that, you know, sort of depopulation things are a myth and a conspiracy theory, and they might well be. I'm open to all of that. I mean, obviously, I'm not in a panic over it or anything like that. So how seriously do I take it? Well, I don't know, but, you know, there have been many people in the past who have alluded to it. It's a fever dream of some. That, I think, is indisputable. And I think what you have to do, if you're thinking about those things, is you have to look at what governments are willing to do to their own population to achieve some sort of a political end. And, you know, it might be a good idea to look into some of the past examples of that, because governments, you know, like human beings are expendable to governments. Like, that's just how that is. It's unfortunate, but it is the reason, one of the reasons I say you can't have a government. Now, you can, of course, because we all do, but this is what you get. This is my point, right? I say this to my wife all the time. Something will happen and it's a ridiculous thing, and I'll say, this is why you can't have a government. I mean, you can, but you're going to get this, right? And history is rife with examples. So to think that you're not expendable, I guess that's really my point here. To think that you're not expendable to the power structure who... Hey there, 2025 editing Mike here. Greetings, everyone. This video, of course, was from last year, and it just was sitting on my phone, never got uploaded. I wanted to make a couple of additional points here and just sort of going through this video and, you know, editing it and whatnot. You know, obviously, I do believe that people are expendable to governments. I mean, obviously not officially and not publicly, generally speaking, but, you know, governments often neglect, certainly out of neglect, right? There's a lot of things that happen where the government will pay lip service to taking care of a specific issue that is harming some, you know, minority group or something like that, and then they promptly do fucking nothing. And, you know, they'll make campaign promises, et cetera, and then promptly do nothing. And right up to a lot of the controversial things that have happened in the U.S. is a good example. It's just because there's a lot of people, you know, in a somewhat free country, there tends to be a little bit more exposure of some of these things, you know, the Northwoods documents and things like that. Some of the things that, you know, what we would call false flag operations and things like that. So I think there's a case to be made for that. And I certainly would never, you know, even if that weren't the case, I would certainly never trust a government. I mean, I think it's all of our individual duty to ourselves to not trust a power structure. I'm not a big Elon Musk fan. I mean, I don't really like Musk or Trump, but that doesn't, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not pleased with some of the things that are happening right now in the U.S. But I did think, I saw a post that Musk put on Twitter the other day, which I thought was kind of a good one. These are the kind of posts I try to put on my personal Facebook feed, just sort of a little bit thought-provoking. I usually try to make them a little bit kind of obscure. I want to make people think a little bit. I don't just want to browbeat people, because there's plenty of that going on anyway. People puking their political opinions all over their friends on Facebook. And, you know, Canada's pretty bad right now with that, because we all got like the elbows up Canada, and, you know, Canada's not for sale. And everybody's got suddenly a whole bunch of Canadian pride, which I find very humorous, because Of course, it's been pretty absent, the patriotism here in Canada. And I'm not a big country guy. I'm not a big government guy. So I don't really care. I usually didn't stand up and sing the national anthem if I went to sporting events. Not because I really disagree with it that much, but I'm kind of I don't know. I don't know what I would call myself, a rabid individualist. I'm not sure, but I just don't like sort of being forced to do something. And not that I was, of course, because I was able to not partake, etc., etc. And I don't go to that many sporting events. Anyway, like I'm talking about, going to a stock car race or something like that. It's not like I got any grief for that. But my point about this is, that these people will talk. I saw one fellow posted recently, a letter to my American friends, why Canada is so pissed off. And it's actually, Canada, this is what people do, right? It's emblematic of the problem we have in the West right now with a near 50-50 split between, sort of generally speaking, the right and the left politically. And that everybody will say, no one wants this. Well, no, people will say that about Trump's policies, for instance, right? Nobody wants, this is not what you want, what you voted for. That's a common phrase I've seen people utter. They're speaking for the people they disagree with politically who've made a vote that they completely disagree with, and they will imagine telling people this is not what you voted for. How about I tell you what I voted for, right? And this is not what America wants. This is not what Canada wants. Well, some of Canada does. Some of America does. Like, you got to contend with that at least. And you should, rather than just try to demonize your opposition, especially the citizenry. I'm all for demonizing politicians. Almost all of them. I can't think of very few or very many that I would say have any kind of integrity anyway. So, and that just comes with the territory, and it ought to, which is, referencing what I was talking about earlier about not trusting your government. But not to get too far out on a tangent here, Elon Musk had a post about the EU, and he said, imagine, imagine loving your government so much that you want your government to have a government. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly, but I thought that was cute. I thought that was interesting, an interesting way to frame it. I don't think he's really wrong, right? Why do you need more layers and levels of fucking government? As though any of this has worked out all that well. This hyper government control of everything, the massive amounts of regulation and control over individual, freedoms and whatnot. Now, I know there's probably lots of big government people watching my channel. I'm just not one of them. Recently, when the USAID stuff came out, and, I saw some of the headlines about what some of these expenditures were, earmarked for and whatnot. And, some of them do look pretty ridiculous. And some of them, really ought to be discussed publicly. This idea that, democracy means everybody gets, I think democracy is immoral to begin with. We know that. We know that I think that. But it's even worse when you just say, well, yeah, but democracy really means that you vote in a leader and then they do whatever the fuck they want. And they hide half of it from you, and they come out sideways if you expose it, and act like, you're threatening, that it's some sort of existential threat if you if you stop sending money for Sesame Street to Muslim countries or something like that, whatever the project du jour is. That's not democracy either. We really should be talking about this stuff, right? Most of these things are ideological. They're not necessarily always, humanitarian, et cetera, et cetera. And even if they are humanitarian, the Liberal Party of Canada is talking about renegotiating with some former Al-Qaeda people, and what does that really mean? Well, at least tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, are going to be shipped out of Canada to go to another country, another foreign country, again, right? And the citizenry doesn't even know about it. So, what we don't know won't hurt us, supposedly, or something along those lines. But anyway, when all this happened, for those of you who don't know, Global Affairs Canada took their website offline. It's kind of the Canadian version of USAID. It's a similar government agency. And they took their list of 173 pages of a list of similar kinds of expenditures. They may even be worse. Like, I read through a partial list because they had been, they were on a Wayback Machine. And I was able to go through and I just, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 57, page 104. Like, I just went through just to make sure, it just wasn't a bunch of terrible stuff on the front page. And it's pretty bad. It's a lot of ideological bullshit, and it's a lot of stuff that I don't think this Canadian citizens would be for. And, again, we'll talk about democracy, but then when it comes to an expenditure that the citizens disagree with, then we'll get a lecture about how, our betters know better, and these are really important, and we just don't understand, et cetera, which again, democracy is a highly misused term, right? It's mostly used to manipulate people. Oh, this is a threat to our democracy. Oh, okay, well, we wouldn't want that, So I did see some of these, 173 pages on the Wayback Machine. But before I got there, I was looking for Global Affairs Canada, and I got to an alphabet soup list of government agencies in Canada. Holy fuck. I don't think anybody signed up for this, right? I mean, and it didn't start that large, now did it? And it isn't going to get smaller. Not unless you have, heaven forbid, a Trumpian type character come along and say, listen, this has gotten way out of hand. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a supporter of Trump necessarily. Like, one of my biggest benchmarks for bad politicians, bad leaders, I should say, is deficit finance. I think it's also immoral. I think it's a form of fraud. You essentially borrowing money in other people's names, arguably people who either have not yet achieved the age of majority consent, or maybe haven't even been born yet. I mean, if you've got a debt of, approaching $40 trillion, like, how soon are you going to pay that back? There have to have been people that are not even in the womb yet who will be paying the interest on that debt. So I think that, that's a form of fraud. And Donald Trump borrowed as much or more money than any president in U.S. history, including, Obama. So, to me, that's a trebuchet to the moon right there. Hey there, 2025 editor Mike, plus 1 day. I'll try to avoid ending up with Inception level layers of intervention here, but one thing I wanted to say is I prefer yeet into the sun. I don't know where I came up with trebuchet to the moon. I think that's too kind. And I'm sure Paul would probably agree with that, at least with the individual I'm referring to in the first place. Also, I always find it interesting when people refer to the social contract. Everybody likes to trot out the social contract. This document that doesn't exist anywhere, that no one ever signed, that the terms were never made clear to anyone, that you're under threat, that you should somehow be ejected from the country if you don't agree, that you never really acquiesced to, that existed before you were born, that applied to you before you were born, et cetera, right? This is what they do when they want to sort of browbeat you into accepting some program or some platform or ideology or whatever it is, this idea that there's some kind of a social contract, that there are a set of unchosen positive moral obligations that actually you did choose. You just didn't know you chose it. So somehow before you were born, you had already acquiesced to deficit finance and, every expenditure too, right? That was part of the social contract, is that you gave carte blanche to politicians that you voted for or politicians you didn't vote for, because by existing in a democracy, you're acquiescing to all this, except when people throw a temper tantrum, when the guy they don't like gets voted in, then suddenly democracy is not so great. And that's what I mean when I say, because all this has, not worked out so well. That's kind of what I'm referring to. But that whole idea, I think, puts the lie to this idea of a social contract, when really, I mean, it's a piss poor concept in the first place. It really is just a cudgel used to try to get people to stop arguing against something or whatever, or to submit, you know. But, you know, again, arguably this unless you have somebody who's willing to, you know, on this term, he seems to be willing to actually excise some of the bloat and some of the corruption and some of the fat. At least, you know, at least if you take him at his word, that's what he's trying to do. And, you know, you may disagree with how he's doing it. You may disagree with that he's doing it at all. I mean, you may think that all these government agencies are completely legit, completely above board, that there's no government waste in spending, et cetera, and that this is all sustainable and an ever increasing debt, you know, constant deficit, constant increase in deficit, yearly threat parade about increasing the debt ceiling and keeping the government working, and all of that is a good thing. I don't know, but anyway, I really don't think they're working for us. Let me put it that way. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention before I close off this video, and you know, sort of, I guess this marks a small return to YouTube. I've got a bunch of videos on my phone that I made prior, and they've just never been uploaded. And I quite frankly filled a 1 terabyte iPhone with videos of me talking. So I thought I would get some of them uploaded, make some room on my phone, and I might make some new content this year. We'll see how that goes. As you can tell, I have lots to say. So, you know, I'll get myself in trouble again, get into some arguments, et cetera, but one of the things that I thought of, I think this was probably the first thing that I thought of, oh, they're having us beta test stuff, was when I was working at the dealership and they first started to come out with the first generation of electronic throttle bodies in the vehicles, sort of the drive-by-wire, throttle-by-wire, essentially. And I remember I had two thoughts. First and foremost, I thought, I ain't doing steer-by-wire. Like, I'm not going to own a car with steer-by-wire. I want a mechanical, you know, as someone who's been driving a car when the power steering fails, and all of a sudden you have Armstrong steering, you know, and of course with modern cars, the steering ratios are so fast that when the power steering goes out, you really are struggling to steer the car. I mean, you can crash. A weaker person can crash easily, and you can crash just by being startled, if nothing else. And I thought, you know, I'm not doing steer-by-wire, you know. If some electrical problem occurs, suddenly you can't steer your car, no thank you. And you know, that's the thing. I mean, that's why I have a job, is mechanical and electronic things break down, right? So yeah, I'm not interested. And then the other thing I thought is, well, why are they doing this? Like, these throttle bodies, you know, when this happened, of course, the price of the computer increased because you've got all these extra complex electronics in the computer, because you need all these redundant systems. When you have an electronic throttle body, you know, it's basically a motor that's operating your throttle for you. When you push down the accelerator pedal, you're essentially pushing a very complex, like a sophisticated sensor array. And so you have to have all this redundancy in there. What you end up with in the throttle pedal is usually about 3 to 4 sensors. Usually there might be like an idle switch, which would be when it's at complete rest, it just sends a signal to the computer that, hey, we're at rest here. And then you will have like 3 potentiometers, and they'll operate at cross voltages, right? So when you start at idle, one of the potentiometers will read, you know, at the computer 0 volts, and another one might read 5 volts. And then as you accelerate, the 5 volt one drops to 0 at wide open throttle, and the 0 volt one rises to 5 volts at wide open throttle. And so there will always be a correlation between those two voltages that at any given point should kind of make sense. There are certain combinations of voltages that would be illogical given the trajectory, the way those two signals cross each other. And then you might have a 0 to 12 volt signal as well. So you'd have a third sensor that's got a different voltage, and it might start at 0 and go to 12 or something like that. This is just a general explanation. Different systems work differently, but this is sort of how they work, is you've got these redundant voltages that operate differently than one another, but what it forms is a pattern of logical voltages in relation to each other to indicate a desired accelerator pedal position. That way the computer can always be running a logic check, and it can be saying, does the input make sense? And if you get three voltages that really should never happen together in combination, then the computer can say, something's wrong here. I can't trust this sensor. And so what I'm going to do is kind of half disable the system. I'm going to put it into some sort of a limp mode, which will allow you only, maximum 25% throttle opening or something like that. So, this can be a problem because the vehicle might not even be able to climb a hill. You've got your foot to the floor, but the most that the engine computer will do is open the throttle 20% or something like that. And these are the redundancies you require and the complex electronics you require to have something like a throttle-by-wire system. You don't need these kind of complex systems for something like a climate control, Like really, if you go to turn the temperature to full hot and the sensor is wacky and it doesn't respond correctly, at least no one's probably going to die. You're probably not going to drive headlong into a school bus or something like that because of that. But with a throttle control, you need it. Similarly, on the throttle body, you need exactly the same kind of a sensor array because you want to be able to very finely control that motor. And you want to know exactly what degree of opening the throttle is at any given time. And so, what you end up with is a more advanced computer with more advanced electronics, so it costs more than the previous version. You end up with a throttle body, which, when they came out, they were much more expensive than they are now. Now you can get them for, $300, $350 Canadian. You could probably get some cheap aftermarket ones for some vehicles, maybe down to 150. But when they came out, to replace them brand new on a GM vehicle, and granted, at that point in time, this would all been done under warranty. Nobody was really buying these if they broke down because the vehicles were new at that time, but they were still like $700, $750. The accelerator pedal position sensor was, $300, $350, something like that. So my rationale at the time was all this to replace a $35 cable, like why, right? And then of course I realized, well, they're having us beta testing this because of course, like the consumer, because ultimately what they're after is autonomous vehicles at some point. And so we're going to need electronic throttle bodies. And we're going to sell it to people as there's some sort of advantage to it. There are some advantages. Cruise control is easier to implement with something like that. It used to be we would have, in the earlier versions, a vacuum dash pod that would also link on to the throttle body. And we would have our normal accelerator pedal and cable system. And then we would have this vacuum system with often its own module calculating speed inputs and the cruise control switches on the dashboard or on the steering wheel inputs to it. And it would pull, you would use vacuum to pull the throttle open on its own. And then they came up with electromotor cruise control, which actually in some ways is very similar to the electronic throttle body I'm describing. It's just that it was a separate module with a motor inside it and a cable attached to the throttle body. And it operated independently, of the throttle inputs and had its own module in there. And when you engage cruise control, an electromotor inside there would actually pull on a throttle cable parallel to the throttle pedal, the throttle cable connected to your foot, and operate the cruise control that way. And yes, electronic throttle bodies bypasses all that. You don't need any of that. In fact, all you need is the cruise control switches and software, because all the hardware is already there. The electronic throttle bodies, they're basically a direct drive. The motor is mounted right on the shaft of the throttle shaft itself, right on the throttle plate. So there's no cables, there's no There's none of that. It's just a motor directly connected there. So yes, it does simplify things like that. But they already had electromotor cruise control. There's nothing to save in a way unless the goal is to remove the human foot, ultimately. It's the same with, we've been using hydraulic power steering systems for a long time, and they work very well. They've been fine. In fact, there's some feel that we've all grown accustomed to in hydraulic power steering systems that they had to mimic when they started changing to electric power steering assist. But why did they change to electric power steering assist? Well, because they're paving the way for electric power steering, steer-by-wire, where when you turn a steering wheel, you're actually just moving a sensor, and a computer is interpreting that and then operating a motor independently of that, connected to the steering rack, and directly steering the tires. Once again, they've got to try to implement something in that steering column that mimics the feedback that we would feel by having a direct connection, even with power steering assist, through the steering column, through the steering rack, all the steering linkages, and ultimately the tires and the ground, and the tarmac below. And so this is a lot of extra work for something that doesn't really improve the vehicle unless the goal is to remove the human being from the driving equation. Now, I'm fully willing to admit, and I'm fully aware that it's quite possible, in fact, probable and likely, that future generations, future versions of autonomous vehicle technology will be ubiquitous, and they'll be better at doing, like most accidents are basically, they're not really accidents. They're a negligence or just an overwhelming of the human senses and skill level and awareness and all of that, situational awareness, all of that. And if you can have a system that doesn't get so easily taxed, cerebrally, at making decisions, that this will all be much safer. I'm fully willing to admit that. I'm not certain of it, but I think the potential is there for sure. There's already arguments made that, like these Tesla autopilot vehicles are safer, per capita than human beings and all of that. But my point here is really that a lot of the things that were happening when it came to developing technology for people's vehicles did not directly benefit them, but they were actually paying for it, right? In the cost of the vehicle. And they were essentially beta testing all of this stuff for the manufacturers. There goes my neighbor, she's going to work. That's what's happening. The consumer was beta testing all this stuff, and there wasn't really any disclosure about that because these things didn't really benefit those cars at that time. In fact, that was right around the time a lot of unintended acceleration claims came through. Now, I'm not saying that those were legitimate necessarily. I think the vast majority of claims of unintended acceleration, right, where the person claims, I was on the brake the whole time and the car just, lurched off and pinned their husband to the back wall of the carport or whatever. These kind of instances, they were human error. I mean, there's something interesting that happens in the human brain when you think that you're pressing on the brake, but your foot is actually resting on the gas pedal. And you even feel, your brain tells you feel the resistance that a brake pedal would be giving you, not the much less resistance, the entirely different feel that an accelerator pedal is giving you. And I think the majority of those were human error, of course. But it is interesting that was the point in time when that occurred, right? The unintended acceleration cases seem to coincide quite a bit. Now, that just might have been the way it was being reported too, right? But seemed to coincide with the advent and the implementation of electronic throttle bodies. Food for thought anyway. I mean, I don't really know, right? Because I don't think that these systems are, like, again, there's the redundancy that I described that kind of makes that, should make it impossible actually for, you know, unless the computer somehow goes haywire. But there's got to be a mode of operation for that to occur, right? There's got to be something that would allow that. You know, it's possible some sort of a internal short circuit could do it, I suppose, but they've never found that, right? Like, that's never been found, at least not to my knowledge anyway. At any rate, back to me to close out the video. Thanks for watching. I mean, you're a useless eater. They've said it, right? So anyway, I'd be very curious to hear what you think. Are we all basically training our replacements? Have a good day.